Well, welcome tonight to Sunday night in New York here on EWTN. And a couple of things I'd like to mention. First of all, our program does appear in Ireland, not on Sunday night, but during the week. And right now in Ireland, there is a tremendously important election coming up. Unfortunately, I wish I could say that there are very clear issues in favor of pro-life. But at least there are a number of candidates that are pro-life. I wish they were a little stronger in their pro-life. I'm half Irish. My father's great uncle was Archbishop of Armagh, successor of St. Patrick, Cardinal Logue. And I am appalled to imagine that there is a possibility of a vote in favor of abortion in Ireland. So I'm speaking to the Irish audience and all the rest to pray that there will not be this very dark stain on Irish history. Irish history has been linked with the history of the church and faith through the centuries of persecution of the longest time. My father's great uncle, Cardinal Logue, was the first Irish cardinal in history in the middle of the 19th century into the 20th, because the church had always been persecuted and there were no Irish cardinals. The churches were not Catholic churches. The bishops, the priests lived and were hunted during the British persecution of Ireland for decades, for centuries. And now Ireland has been very free with its church over the century. And here we find there is a possibility of a vote in favor of abortion in Ireland. Unbelievable and a disaster. I want to mention next week our guest, a very eminent, respected Catholic theologian and writer, George Weigel. And George will be speaking on Christian values in the secular world. He's an outstanding writer, a wonderful gentleman, and a near neighbor of mine. So I hope that you'll pay very close attention. Now, this evening, our visitor is also a very good friend of mine for many, many years. And this is Pastor Bernard Ruffin. And I want to tell you that he is the editor or the writer of an outstanding book on Padre Pio. He's written on Catholic saints, a Lutheran pastor, and Brother Andre, the Blessed Andre, and now Saint Padre Pio. And his book, they can show us on there, Padre Pio, the True Story. And we want to take, that's the new edition of your book there. But what we want to do is take up another book written against Padre Pio, and in many ways against Christianity. And Sergio Luzzatto, Padre Pio, Miracles and Politics in a Secular Age. This is published by Metropolitan Books, and they should be ashamed themselves for putting out this book. This is an attack, sweetly done, carefully done, of an attack of Padre Pio, and it's a translated book. So, Pastor, welcome. It's so good to have you.
Thank you.
And I know you've got lots to think about. Tell us a bit about your pastorate.
Yes, I am.
Where are you located?
The Lutheran Church of the Holy Comforter in Washington, D.C.
And you've been a pastor how many years?
34 years.
34 years.
No, 36 years.
Mm-hmm. Good. And you've been on our broadcast before, yes.
Yes, I have.
And what about, well, first of all, how did you get to be involved with Padre Pio?
I first heard about Padre Pio when I was in college, and there was nothing better to do on Saturday evenings than to go through old newspaper files. And I was really looking for articles on Teresa Neumann, who was the better known, at least in America at that time, for having the stigmata. I've always been, even as a boy, interested in instances where the hand of God is manifested in human history. And in looking for articles about Teresa Neumann, I found an article about Padre Pio, which I didn't think much about at the time because I don't think it was too well written. But this would have been probably in late 67 or early 68. And a few months later, I was at the Old North Terminal in the Washington airport, about to fly back. We lived in Chevy Chase, Maryland, and I was going back to college at Bowdoin. And there was a little brown book in the bookstore on the book rack, The Priest Who Bears the Wounds of Christ. And I picked that up and read it, and I was much impressed, although later I found out that there were a number of exaggerations there. But that's how I first learned about Padre Pio. Around that time, I did write a letter to him asking whether or not I should be a Roman Catholic. That was a time in life when I was trying to determine in what community I would serve the Lord. And I got a letter back, not from him, but from his secretary, saying that Padre Pio is praying for you, and he says to trust entirely in the goodness of God. And that's very interesting because that's probably one of my greatest difficulties, trusting entirely in God's goodness. So I don't know whether he actually saw my letter. Later on, I determined that the letter was written by Father Joseph Pius, who had later on became a friend of mine. However, I'd lost the letter, and I didn't find the letter until a few months after Joseph Pius had gone to his reward. So I'll never know whether Padre Pio actually saw or read my letter.
Well, now, most of us, our audience, know much about Padre Pio. Some people do not. He is a Capuchin friar, and he is a stigmatic. He has the wounds of Christ in his hands, feet, and side. And the first stigmatist that were recorded in history is St. Francis himself. And Padre Pio, I understand, is the first priest who was ever a stigmatic. And tell us a bit about his life.
Well, he was born in a place called Pietrelcina, which is in south-central Italy.
Excuse me just a minute. We have up on the screen a photograph of Padre Pio as a very young priest. And the superiors told them to take off the bandages, wash his hands, and take this picture to take it. It was not to be given out to public. That was part of the record. And you see the wounds very clearly.
So he was born in Pietrelcina. His family were farmers. They owned a little bit of land, but they were just a bit above peasant status. And he, from a very early age, wanted to be a Capuchin priest. And his father came to America to work so that he could get a high school, what the equivalent of a high school education, which was requisite for him to enter the Capuchin order. But he, very early in his ministry, at the time of his ordination, he offered himself as a victim to God. He wanted to participate in the sufferings of Christ on the cross. In I think it's Colossians, the first chapter of Colossians, St. Paul says that he makes up what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ for the sake of the church. And this was part of Padre Pio's ministry, to offer up his sufferings to to the cross. He offered up his sufferings to Christ to join in his saving work, to bring humanity to God. And so shortly after that, he began to experience the pains in his hands and feet and side. But it wasn't until a few years later, in 1918, that they actually appeared visibly.
And they never stopped until just before death.
Just before he died.
And he had no scars.
At the time of his death, there were no scars, which is, from what I understand, miraculous, because it was absolutely proved that the wounds in his hands were deep, and any wounds that were that deep, even if they healed, would leave a scar. But his hands and feet and side were photographed after he died, and they were perfect. There was nothing there.
One of the Capuchins who worked with Padre Pio, as assigned to be his secretary, told us that when the scabs, which they come off occasionally, and the wounds are very clear, that you actually, if you held his hand up in front of a light, you could see some light coming through the wound.
Yes.
Yes, there's a membrane there, but you actually could see the light. What an incredible person. And but that was not really the great thing about Padre Pio. The immense crowds of people, particularly after the Second World War, American soldiers had gone to visit him, and that's when he became very popular. Initially, the Pope, Pope Benedict, and Pope Pius XI were very hard on Padre Pio. He never left his little village. He never defended himself. But there was people who spoke against Pio. Some of them represent reputable people, and said that they thought it was either an illusion or a subterfuge. And it was later under Pope Pius XII that he was given permission to see people. And I spoke to many people in my life who actually saw Padre Pio. They found it a kind of joyous little elf. He kind of a real peasant friar. And he had a profound influence on history, because after the Second World War, it seemed like Italy would go to communism. It would join with Soviet Russia, and it would be right in the middle of Western Europe as a communist country. And I heard a number of people, including the Father General of the Capuchin Order, say that it was because of Padre Pio that Italy had not gone communist. So he had a profound influence on her history. It's very fascinating, of course, that you have written a beautiful book on Padre Pio, and you're a Lutheran pastor. Did you write anybody else like that?
Did I write about anybody
else?
I wrote about Brother Andre.
Brother Andre.
And I wrote about Fanny Crosby, who was a Methodist hymn writer, and a very holy lady, a blind lady.
And Brother Andre in Canada, who is now Saint Andre.
That's right.
And Padre Pio is also a saint. They're both canonized. You better be careful. You get too close to these people. Now, it's... I did not see Padre Pio. In those days, the Capuchins were not encouraged to go there to visit, because they didn't want to make it to be a circus. So the Father General asked the friars not to go there without special permission. And Padre Pio never left that little village, and there was no attempt to make it a popular place to go. It was hard to get there. You had to drive. And the local people were deeply devoted to him. Interestingly, the Archbishop of that area, the Archbishop of Manfredonia, had given Padre Pio a very hard time.
That's right.
It's a mixed story.
Yes.
It's a mixed story. We have a break now. We'll be back, and we want you, while we're having our break and our next several minutes, to start calling up and ask us some good questions, or perhaps some of you have experiences spiritually with Padre Pio. If you have an opportunity to read Pastor Ruffin's book, which is published by our Sunday Visitor,
yes,
I would suggest that you get it by all means. And I'd suggest that you not get Luziato's book, but just Metropolitan Books, because it's sarcastic and it distorts things. What do you think of his book?
Yes, well, basically what he does is he takes all the negative things that were ever told about Padre Pio and sets them down without letting the reader know that they were refuted. Perhaps you could take an example. Let's say somebody was, this is the 100th anniversary of Ronald Reagan. Let's say somebody wanted to prepare a biography of Reagan, and all they did was to look up all the negative things that they could find and none of the positive ones and set them down without any explanation. That is what Luzzatto did. He took all of the accusations that were made against him throughout his ministry and wrote them as if they were the truth.
And of course, he does not deny the possibility, he denies completely the possibility of the supernatural or the miraculous.
It seems like his approach is how to explain how this simple, silly man, at times he seems to refer to him as if he was a simpleton who was manipulated by unscrupulous religious authorities. At other times he considers him a charlatan. He refers to him as a new Rasputin and an idol of straw, and other negative, addresses him and speaks of him in other negative ways. He presents him as if he were just a crook, a fraud.
And just a line out of this Luziato's book. All these factors to which we must add the Capuchin friar's unique status as a priest with the stigmata help to explain why Padre Pio's story was so troubled, so laborious, so fitful. And they help to account for the final performance, the one offered in St. Peter's Square in Rome on that spring day in 1999. Sarcastic.
Yes.
Yeah. Who needs this? You know, that's what I have to say. And I would suggest, if you are a book, somebody who likes to read books, you might write a book, a letter to the publishers here, Metropolitan Books, part of Holt and Company, 175 Fifth Avenue, New York City, 10010, and write them and tell them what they think. And they also have www.henryholt, one line, HENRYHOLT.com. And let them have it. Let them have it. I'm a New Yorker. I don't think you just sit around and smile at this nonsense.
Yeah, I think he takes the position that, of course, this could not be true. Of course, everyone knows that no one could genuinely have the stigmata. No one could genuinely be the means of miraculous healings. No one could genuinely have all the spiritual gifts that Padre Pio had. So somehow there had to be a fraud. And how could modern people be taken in by this pathetic creature?
The book is basically not against Padre Pio. It's against faith.
Yes.
It's against belief in God and a belief in a personal God and certainly in denial of Jesus Christ. There's no question. And with his name, Sergio Luzzatto, I suspect that he was baptized. And probably someplace, his mother or grandmother someplace is praying for him right now. Father, with Padre Pio and the accounts of many things in the world over those 50 years, where Padre Pio came into people's lives. Have you got some of those examples?
Yes, I mean, there were many examples. There was one man, I'm not going to mention names, but he said that he went to make his confession to Padre Pio, and Padre Pio was able to tell him everything that he ever did, including the sins that he had committed. And after that, all he could do was cry, cry, cry. And after that, his life was never the same. There are many, many accounts similar to that, where people went to make their confession to him. Usually it was during or after a confession that Padre Pio was able to tell them things about themselves that he never could have learned on his own, and that had a profound effect on their lives.
I know someone that happened to, and he purposely made up a confession. And Padre Pio waited, and he got all finished, and he said, "Now there's a couple of things that you forgot." And the man was practically ready to faint right in the confessional. Others who were there were not even thinking of being a religious vocation, and he changed their life. The very fine young priest, I don't want to mention his name, he was a young priest then. He was not a priest, he was a soldier at the end of the Second World War. He was not a Catholic, but they brought him up, and Padre Pio took his hand and asked him something to him. And he didn't know what he said. And this was a Capuchin later on, and he was there that day, Father Dolan and Hecky. And this other man said, "What did he say to you?" To me. He said, "Well, I don't want to tell you." "Well, what did he tell you?" He said, "When you go home, you're going to become a Capuchin." He said, "What's a Capuchin?" Because he was not a Catholic. And the rest of his life, he spent his time as a Capuchin. He enjoyed.
Then there were also instances where someone had intended to become a priest, and he would say, "No, you're going to get married."
Yes, I know that.
Yeah.
I know people that had that too.
But there was a priest, I guess I can mention his name. He's gone to his reward, Father John St. John. He was a Jesuit who was a chaplain during the Second World War. And one time Padre Pio said to him, "Go and find Sergeant so-and-so," and he gave the whatever unit was he was in, and tell him that his baby has been born. This was during the Second World War. So he went and found the sergeant and said, I'm coming to you from Padre Pio." The sergeant said, "Who?" He'd never heard of Padre Pio. He said, "Well, never mind. Padre Pio said to tell you that your son or daughter, whatever it was, has been born safely, and your wife is doing fine." And the man was flabbergasted because he was overseas. His wife was expecting. He hadn't heard anything for days or weeks. And this was the first time that he learned what was later confirmed, that the child was born when Padre Pio said he was born. And another time, Father St. John said he took 3 service people up to see Padre Pio, and they were not living good lives. And so normally when Padre Pio met the service people, he would embrace them and would be very warm and effusive. But this time he just shook hands and said, "Buongiorno." And then he called Father St. John aside and said, "Questi uomini peccati et peccaminosi, cattivi e peccaminosi," bad and sinful people. And it turned out that the one serviceman was sleeping with the service woman, and the other man was an alcoholic, and he'd never met them.
Mm-hmm. People would tell you many stories like this.
But he had this in a diary.
Yeah.
When I interviewed Father St. John, he had his diary. I don't know what's ever become of it, but he was reading directly from the diary, so it wasn't, something third hand. This was his own experience.
Oh, yeah. There were a lot of things in Padre Pio when people went there directly, particularly after the war.
But another thing Luzzatto says is that most of the biographies are based on the writings of this man, Emanuele Brunato, who was a supporter of Padre Pio, who was sort of like a shady operator. My father was a police official. He would call him a hustler. And he did contribute a lot of money to the hospital. But it's not true that most of the accounts are based on his recollections. There are many, many, many primary sources about Padre Pio. Father Dominic Meyer was a Capuchin, was an American who was Padre Pio's secretary. And many of his letters, he would write circular letters home, and he would describe some of the things that had gone on. And according to another man was Joe Peterson, who was a serviceman during the war. He later worked for the post office in Long Island, I believe, and he would spend a month in the summer. And he talked to Father Dominic, and Father Dominic told him that he had asked Padre Pio once, when you say you see people's guardian angels, what do you mean? Do you really see them? And Padre Pio pointed to him and said, Domenico, when I say I see someone's guardian angel, I see them just like I see you. And there are many, many first-hand accounts of people who worked with Padre Pio over the years, accounts of his superiors, the diary of Padre Agostino and Padre Paulino, just dozens of things. So this is absolutely nonsense that all of these are crazy stories invented by a sharp operator who was not trustworthy. Almost nothing that you find in most of the biographies of Padre Pio comes from Brunato, because the Capuchins were ashamed of him, wanted people to stay away from anything that he had written. So this is just hogwash.
Well, it's not a surprise. If you look through the history of the church, people who are known very clearly as saints, people chosen by divine providence, people who have lifted themselves up to respond to grace. In such a situation, in such a situation, when people are like that, then you must expect that they will be attacked. And the perfectly example of it is our Lord Jesus Christ. Completely, his holy life, doing good things. He is attacked endlessly and finally tortured to death. This is what you expect. Don't be surprised. I would be disappointed with Padre Pio if everybody thought he was wonderful. I would have. Interestingly enough, though, I've spoken to a number of people who are psychologists and who are religiously oriented people, not necessarily Catholic or Christian. And they have been fascinated by Padre Pio. They want to hear the whole thing. It's a beautiful example of divine providence and God's grace coming into everyday world. And Padre Pio, like with the guardian angel, he's a simple peasant person. That's how he's going to say it, of course. And I was so pleased to know that Pope John Paul, as a young priest, had visited Padre Pio, and that he took him very seriously, and that's how he was canonized. We're going to be having a break in a few minutes, and we'll have questions, and we'll be very grateful if you will take the questions. I want you to mention, though, where our cameramen, would you put on the front here? I want to explain. Here in the front is one of my oldest confreres together. We ordained together, Father Christopher Dietrich, who's wearing his dark brown Capuchin habit, like Padre Pio. And along with him is Father Andrew Apostoli, who you all know, who is wearing exactly the same habit, but it's gray because we started our little community. And so we hope someday to be able to be back with the Capuchins. So that's where you see the two in the front. I'll be back in a couple of minutes. Well, we have our first call from Maryland. Maryland, tell us where you're from and what you're going to ask us.
I'm from Amarillo, Texas, by way of New Orleans, Louisiana. Anyway, God bless you both very much. I wanted to ask Pastor Ruffin what he could tell us about Padre Pio's bilocation experiences.
There were many occasions, well, I won't say many, there were a number of occasions in which Padre Pio, who never left San Giovanni Rotondo from 1916 until he died in 1968, was seen and conversed and spoken to in other parts of Italy and other parts of the world. For instance, somebody might have been, let's say, in France, and they would see him at a crucial time, and it was usually a time of crisis. And Padre Pio said, "Wherever the Lord wants me to be, there I am." He could never explain how that worked. Someone once asked him, when you were visiting somebody, let's say in Ireland, what was the furniture like? What did the landscape look like? And he said he didn't know. All he knew was the person that he was dealing with. There was I don't know, I'll try to condense this. The most famous instance occurred when he was a seminarian, when he was 17, and he found himself in a house in northern Italy where the father was, the man was dying. The man was a Mason. He was not a believer. He didn't want the last rites at all. He didn't want any religious activity around him, but his wife was pregnant, and so it was then Fra Pio went out to the Masons who were standing around and said that he had to baptize a child, and they let him through because he had to baptize the girl. Much later, and he wrote this down. He wrote down what had happened. Much later, this girl, whose name was Rizzani, Giovanna Rizzani, encountered Padre Pio at St. Peter's in Rome. She had gone there when she was 17, this was 1922, to make her confession. It was late in the day. The custodian said, "It's too late, go home, all the priests are gone." But she saw a Capuchin priest who beckoned her into the confessional. She made the confession to him. After she came out, the guard said, "Didn't I tell you to go home?" She said, "Well, yes, but this priest said that he had time to hear my confession, and that's what I did." And the custodian opened the door of the confessional, and he said, "See, there's nobody here. What are you talking about?" And later on, she happened to go to San Giovanni Rotondo and happened to meet Padre Pio, and he was the man whom she encountered at St. Peter's. And he said, "I've been waiting for you all my life. You were born when your father was dying, and the Blessed Mother entrusted you to me." So it was documented because he wrote that down back in 1905. And then in 1922, the baby, who was now a teenage girl, actually came to see him. And that's probably one of the most famous and one of the best documented cases of bilocation, where he appeared to be in two places at once.
And that was very early in his life.
Yes, he was 17.
17. So you're dealing with a holy man throughout his life.
Yes.
Yes. A teenager.
Yes. Even as a little boy, he was considered very holy. Well, his parents were very devout.
We have a call from Steve. Where are you from, Steve, and what are you going to tell us?
I'm from New Hampshire. My question is, I find it very odd that Father Pio never showed his hands in public, went up to people in crowds and he always was in bandages. He never took the bandages off in public around crowds. Nobody could actually see the stigmatism. No doctors have reports or pictures of his hands without the bandages on. Now, you always mention about people back in 1905 or whatever it is. You can't mention certain people's names because they're alive, but you can mention people's names that are dead, so nobody can interview them. There's a picture of him right now up on the screen. That means nothing. That picture, it looks to me like it's doctored. Look at the color of his beard, and look at his hands. It's black. So that looks like a doctored picture to me. But he never went in public and showed his hands to doctors or people. And there's no pictures from doctors themselves that can verify this. But that picture you just showed to me right now, that's a doctored picture. He's got a black and gray beard. It's the same color as his hands. Blood is not like that.
First of all, with regard to the photograph, it was an early color photograph, and in many of those the color is distorted. But he was examined by several doctors who left detailed reports. There were at least 3 who wrote detailed reports back in 1918. There were doctors who examined him throughout his life. Now, he covered his hands because his superiors wanted him to, and also out of modesty. He did not want people to see the stigmata. But however, during Mass, he had to uncover his hands. And so anybody that was close could see the stigmata. Of course, a lot of the people that I mention are dead because he died in 1968. So the people that knew him very well obviously would be dead or very old. But I knew very well Padre Alessio, who's dead, who died in 2000, but he actually saw the wounds in his hands. Normally, Padre Pio cleaned his hands in a corner. He didn't like people to see them. But on this occasion, he fainted. And so Alessio came to his assistance, and he saw the wounds. And he said that you could see the sunlight through the wounds. So there are many, many people who actually saw the wounds. You saw at the very beginning of the show a picture taken under obedience. In other words, Padre Pio's superiors made him pose, and you could see it's in black and white, the wounds in his hands. So those are very well documented. And as we said, he was commanded by his superiors not to show his wounds in public, and he didn't want to, out of modesty.
Yes, I don't want to into responding to our caller, but obviously he is exhibiting very strong hostile prejudice against the Catholic Church. Perhaps he says his reasons, but he did not make an objective approach to this situation. We have a call now from Russell. Russell, where are you from, and what are you going to ask us? Are you there, Russell? Do we have another caller then? All right. We have another caller. Well, how about someone in our audience? Father Christopher.
Father Benedict, you and I went to the seminary together. We struggled through all of those years together, and we were ordained together in 1954 in Sacred Heart Monastery here in Yonkers, where I'm
59,
stationed.
I'm sorry.
Excuse me, 59. I entered the order in 54. Right. Today, if you could see him, Benedict is wearing the same habit as me, except it's the color of gray. Now, I'm sure a lot of people would be interested to know the story behind that.
But you tell them. Father Christopher, you give it. Why is it gray?
Yes.
You tell us.
Well, Father Benedict was probably one of the holiest seminarians that I had ever had encountered in the seminary. And Father Benedict, I guess was not completely happy with the way things were run in the Capuchins, and he founded this other group.
The actual fact, it comes close, but we were disappointed with some of the events that took place in the late part of the 20th century. And many people were very unhappy, not just us. And we had decided to start, with the permission of the Father General and of the Holy See, to start a reform group of Capuchins. And we had that permission. Unfortunately, some of the Capuchin provincials at that time in the United States objected to that. Not from the general who came to visit us, and not for the father who would later be the other general, who is now a bishop. But we were treated very, very well. And I have no complaints at all about how the Capuchins have treated our community since that very day. And I would hope and pray to God that we will be canonically the same community. And I'd love to have it happen before I'm dead. So I'm taking good care of my health. As Father Christopher, he's much younger than me, at least a few months. We have Russell calling us. We got you back, Russell. Are you there? Russell?
Yes.
Where are you?
Good evening.
Yes.
Greetings from New Hampshire, which is the only state in the Union which is mentioned in the Bible. Although a dumb legislature's changed it since. In the Old Testament times, it used to be called the Garden of Eden.
Oh, I see. Well, Russell, what do you got for a question?
Speaking of the Garden of Eden, I would say that in the Garden of Eden, there was only, in the garden, the first covenant, the now closed out, there was only one true church, or religious body, Judaism. Under the Old New Testament, there's still one true faith, the Catholic Church, through which salvation flows, as it were. My respects to the pastor, why don't you enter the true church? Thank you.
Well, it's a long story. I guess I could say that there are many people who have truly been concerned about being where God wanted them to be, and for some reason they weren't in the Roman Catholic Church. In many ways, I would like to be. I hope my bishop isn't listening, but things have not worked out in such a way that it is practical at this point. That's I could write quite a lot about that, but at this time I have a congregation, and I believe that they want me to serve them, and that's what I'm going to do.
You know, we all regret that the unity of the church came apart several times in church history and in the big the big one at the time of the Reformation. But there was the separation with the Eastern Church, the Orthodox and the Catholic, and there were others during earlier times. It's unfortunate. But what you have is many sincere, believing people, some of them saintly people. And that's what you have to respect. You should not be respecting an institution. You should respect the immortal soul of the life of the individual person. And anybody could tell you that inside the Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church and a lot of other churches, there's some people that are way off the beam. And there are other people who, looking carefully, sincerely, doing the best they can. Can it well be that in the providence of God and the love of Christ, that the salvation of souls is best accomplished at the present time with various denominations? Could that be the providence of God? And I would say the writings, the observations of our present Holy Father, in many more words than that, is saying the same thing. And I think that would have been true also of Pope John Paul. We have a call from Penny. Penny, where are you from, and what are you going to ask us?
I'm from Port Richey, Florida.
Port Richey.
And I've read a lot about Padre Pio, and the only thing that I ever really wanted to ask anybody a question about was what was the reason that they kept him from practicing Mass or celebrating Mass? Because for a priest, that's his calling. Was it a form of punishment for some reason, or was it, again, for what you were talking about before, that it was for humility?
He was never kept from celebrating Mass, but from approximately 1932 to 34, somewhere in there, he was forbidden to say Mass in public. He had to say Mass privately within the friary, and that was because of the not only because of some of the opposition from the Archbishop. Actually, by that time, that Archbishop had retired, but a lot of the problem came from some of his followers. There were a lot of mentally disturbed people in San Giovanni, according to one of the priests that worked there, and there were a lot of fanatical women. And at one point, the people thought that Padre Pio was going to be transferred, and they rioted, and they uprooted a street lamp and used it as a battering ram to break into the friary to try to get at a priest who was visiting Padre Pio, whom they thought was sent by the Vatican to take him away. So a lot of that, those restrictions came not because of Padre Pio himself, but because of the local people who created problems for him.
And, it's a long story. It's many different people. If you read the life of St. Francis, which we always present so beautifully, almost like a stained glass window, there were people at that time who hated St. Francis and detested him and said that he was not a true person. So that's something. I have something I wanted to tell you, though. I didn't want to miss it. That I have my own Padre Pio story. When I was a high school boy, I heard of Padre Pio, and I knew the Capuchins near our house, the Italian Capuchins, the Cappuccini. And I was very impressed by them. And so finally, I joined the Capuchins. And while I was there, I was for many years a Capuchin, and I love the Capuchins, and I hope that our community will be back still, again, part of it. But I heard about Padre Pio, and I was very, very impressed. And there was a certain moment in my life, was just about to be ordained a priest, and I was supposed to be sent to Rome to study Scripture, to teach. I was very anxious to preach, live with the poor, which I ended up doing. But because I had an argument, a polite argument, with William Buckley and another friar, a political one, I got canned. And the priest in charge came and said in the morning, "You're not going to Rome, you don't have to study." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because we don't think you know how to preach." And I've been doing this for years. And then he came back 2 minutes later, and he had a letter. He said, "This letter, just in the mail from Europe, just arrived for you." And I opened it, and it came from San Giovanni Rotondo. And someone had asked Padre Pio to write a note to this young friar being ordained. And it was a little holy car, and it said, "Gesù sea tuo conforto suo sostegno, Padre Pio." And it means, may Christ be your comfort and your strength, Padre Pio. I want to tell you that if the Archangel Michael had not come into the door, I would not have been more surprised. Thank you, Pastor, very, very much.
Thank you.
Very grateful. And we have our program to the end. Please don't forget to support EWTN. We do need the help. And Mother Angelica will be praying for you. God bless.